When I gave birth to twin daughters, my cruel husband and mother-in-law burst out in anger. "You never give us good news," my husband shouted as he struck me and threw divorce papers in my face before leaving me alone. I cried for help, but they both abandoned me with my newborns. Desperate, I called my elder brother, and before they could return home, a shocking surprise awaited them. "Hi, I'm Laura. My story is not something I imagined I'd ever share, but perhaps someone out there might learn from it or find strength in it." I was 29, living in a suburban city and married to Ryan, my college classmate. Our love story seemed perfect, almost like a fairy tale. We met during our final year at university, bonded over shared dreams, and before long, we were inseparable. After graduation, we decided to take the next step and got married. The first few years of our marriage were beautiful. Ryan worked as a businessman, managing his import-export ventures, while I took care of our home. I loved our life together and was genuinely happy. Ryan seemed to adore me, always promising me a bright future. His mother, Margaret, was a regular presence in our lives. She was a strong-willed woman in her mid-50s, often opinionated but generally kind, or so I thought. Things took a major turn when I found out I was pregnant. It was one of the happiest moments of my life. I couldn't wait to share the news with Ryan and Margaret. I still remember the evening vividly. Ryan had just come back from work, looking exhausted but in good spirits. Margaret had come over for dinner, which she often did. With my heart pounding with excitement, I decided to share the news over dessert. "Ryan, Margaret," I began, struggling to contain my smile. "I have some wonderful news. We're going to have a baby." Ryan's face lit up instantly, and Margaret clasped her hands together with what I believed to be genuine joy. "Oh, Laura, that's amazing," Ryan exclaimed, pulling me into a tight hug. Margaret nodded approvingly, adding, "This is wonderful news for the family. You've made us so proud." In that moment, I felt everything was perfect. Little did I know that this happiness was fleeting. Throughout my pregnancy, things appeared normal on the surface. Ryan attended doctor's appointments with me, and Margaret would occasionally drop by with home-cooked meals. I thought we were growing closer as a family. However, there were moments, small, seemingly insignificant at the time, where Margaret would make comments about wanting a grandson. "You know, Ryan was my firstborn," she'd say with a wistful smile. "Having a grandson would be a dream come true. Boys carry the family name, after all." Ryan would nod in agreement, and I would laugh nervously, brushing it off. "We'll be happy no matter what the baby is," I'd reply. But deep down, I started noticing a pattern in their behavior. Ryan and Margaret were increasingly fixated on the idea of having a boy. As my due date approached, my excitement was mixed with anxiety. I didn't understand why I felt uneasy. Perhaps some part of me sensed that something wasn't right. The day of my delivery finally arrived, earlier than expected. I went into labor late at night, and Ryan drove me to the hospital. Margaret insisted on coming along, and I didn't mind. I thought their presence was a sign of support. Little did I know it was anything but. The labor was long and exhausting, but when it was over, the doctor announced with a smile, "Congratulations, Laura, you've given birth to twin girls." I was overjoyed. Twin daughters. I couldn't wait to hold them and show them to Ryan. However, when Ryan and Margaret came to see me, their faces weren't filled with the joy I had anticipated. Instead, they were pale, as if the doctor had delivered terrible news. "Two girls?" Ryan muttered under his breath, his expression unreadable. Margaret, standing behind him, looked equally stunned. She whispered something to Ryan, and they both left the room without saying much. At that moment, I was too overwhelmed by exhaustion and emotion to question their behavior. It wasn't until I was moved to a private room that the full weight of their reaction hit me. Ryan walked in, his face dark with anger. Before I could speak, he erupted. "You've never brought me any good news, Laura," he shouted, his voice echoing through the room. "Two girls? This is your fault." His words hit me like a physical blow. "What are you talking about, Ryan? There are daughters. Beautiful, healthy babies. How can this be bad news?" But he wasn't listening. He threw a set of papers onto the bed. "This is your punishment, Laura. I'm divorcing you. I want nothing to do with you or your daughters." I was stunned into silence. My hands trembled as I picked up the papers. It was a divorce notice hastily signed. Before I could process what was happening, Margaret walked in, her face devoid of sympathy. "This was my idea, Laura," she said coldly. "You failed this family. We don't need you anymore." They both walked out, leaving me alone in the sterile hospital room. I sat there, holding the divorce papers in one hand and clutching the thin hospital blanket with the other, unable to stop the tears from falling. My heart felt shattered into a million pieces. I had been abandoned at the most vulnerable moment of my life. I sat in that hospital room for what felt like hours, holding my daughters in my arms. They were so tiny, so innocent, and yet they had been rejected by their own father and grandmother. The betrayal burned deep, but my tears dried quickly. I realized I had to do something, not just for me, but for my daughters. I couldn't let them grow up in a world where they were made to feel unwanted. That night, as I rocked my daughters to sleep, I met Dr. Olivia. She wasn't just my attending doctor. She became an unexpected source of comfort. She entered the room quietly, her face soft with concern. "Laura," she said, sitting by my bedside, "I heard what happened. Are you okay?" I shook my head, unable to find the words. Her eyes were filled with genuine empathy. "Listen, I know this isn't what you imagined for yourself, but you're not alone. There are people who care about you. If you need help, please let me know." Her kindness brought a flicker of hope to my heart. I whispered, "Thank you, Dr. Olivia. I don't know what I'll do yet, but I need to figure this out for them." I glanced down at my daughters, who were now fast asleep. The first step I took was to call my elder brother, David. He lived out of town and was a successful businessman. David had always been my protector even when we were kids. When I told him everything, how Ryan and Margaret had abandoned me and the twins, his reaction was immediate and fierce. "Laura, don't worry," he said over the phone, his voice steady and reassuring. "You're not alone in this. I'll be there for you every step of the way. Let me handle this." His words were like a balm to my shattered heart. A few days later, I was discharged from the hospital and went to stay with David. He welcomed us into his home with open arms, making sure I had everything I needed for the twins. For the first time since that horrible day, I felt a sense of safety. But safety wasn't enough. I needed justice. David and I sat down one evening after the twins had fallen asleep. "Laura," he began, his tone serious, "we need to expose them for who they really are. Ryan and Margaret think they can walk away from this without consequences, but they're wrong." "How?" I asked. "What can we do?" "We start by finding out their secrets," David replied. "People like Ryan and Margaret don't live clean lives. They must have something to hide." David hired a private investigator, a man named Mr. Carter, who was known for his thorough and discreet work. "Give him a week," David assured me. "He'll dig up everything we need." While we waited for the investigation to unfold, I tried to adjust to my new reality. Taking care of twins was exhausting, but every smile, every tiny coup reminded me why I was fighting so hard. Dr. Olivia checked in with me regularly, offering advice and encouragement. I also found solace in speaking to David, who was my rock through it all. Exactly a week later, Mr. Carter called with news. "I've found something," he said. "Ryan and Margaret are involved in an illegal import-export operation. It's a pretty extensive setup, smuggling banned goods, evading taxes, and using shell companies to cover their tracks." The revelation shocked me. I had always known Ryan's business was successful, but I never imagined it was built on illegal activities. Margaret's involvement wasn't surprising. Her controlling nature made it clear she would do anything to maintain power. David and I decided to take immediate action. We hired a lawyer to build a strong case against them. I was hesitant at first. After all, this was the father of my children, but David's words convinced me. "Laura, they betrayed you in the worst way," he said firmly. "This isn't just about revenge. It's about ensuring they don't hurt anyone else." With the lawyer's help, we gathered all the evidence Mr. Carter had uncovered. Simultaneously, I turned to social media to expose their true nature. I was careful with my posts, sharing just enough to make people aware of what had happened without jeopardizing our legal case. The response was overwhelming. People reached out with messages of support and outrage. Many couldn't believe the cruelty I had endured, while others shared their own stories of betrayal and resilience. It was empowering to know I wasn't alone. As the case began to take shape, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for my daughters, to show them that their mother was strong and capable of standing up to injustice. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparation and determination. With David by my side and the lawyer guiding us, we began piecing together a case so airtight that Ryan and Margaret wouldn't have a chance to escape justice. But even with all the evidence, I knew that facing them in court wouldn't be easy. Still, I reminded myself of why I was doing this, for my daughters and for every injustice I had endured. Our private investigator, Mr. Carter, had uncovered everything we needed. The details of Ryan and Margaret's illegal import-export business were more shocking than I could have imagined. They had been smuggling banned goods into the country, using fake companies to launder money and evading taxes for years. Margaret was not just complicit. She was the mastermind behind most of the operations. It was clear now how they had managed to build their wealth. Armed with this information, our lawyer, Ms. Bennett, began preparing the legal documents. "Laura," she said during one of our meetings, "the evidence we have is solid, but their lawyers will fight back. Be prepared for a tough battle." "I'm ready," I replied firmly. I didn't have the luxury of fear or hesitation anymore. At the same time, I continued to use social media to expose the truth. My posts were carefully worded, sharing my story and hinting at the evidence without compromising the case. I described how Ryan and Margaret had abandoned me and my daughters, emphasizing their preference for a male heir and their cruel betrayal. I never mentioned the illegal activities directly, but the public outcry against their behavior was overwhelming. Comments poured in. Strangers offered their support. Women shared their own stories of betrayal, and some even volunteered to help in any way they could. The more people learned, the more they stood with me. It felt like I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for all the women who had faced similar injustices. Then came the day we filed the case in court. It was a surreal moment, watching the evidence we had gathered turn into an official document that would bring Ryan and Margaret to justice. The charges included financial fraud, tax evasion, smuggling, and abandonment. But filing the case was only the first step. Ryan and Margaret's lawyers immediately responded with counterclaims, accusing me of defamation and trying to tarnish their reputation out of spite. I wasn't surprised. This was exactly the kind of tactic I expected from them. Their arrogance was their downfall. They believed they were untouchable. The court date was set, but in the meantime, I faced another challenge. Margaret, in a last-ditch attempt to regain control, tried to manipulate the narrative. She reached out to family members and mutual friends, spinning lies about me. According to her, I was an ungrateful wife who had always sought to ruin their family. Some people believed her, but others, knowing her manipulative nature, stood by me. David was my anchor during this time. "Laura," he said one evening, "don't let her get to you. The truth will come out, and when it does, she won't be able to hide anymore." Meanwhile, the media began picking up on the story. News outlets caught wind of my social media posts and the upcoming trial, and the coverage only amplified the public's interest. The more attention the case received, the more pressure it put on Ryan and Margaret. Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. I walked into the courtroom with David and Ms. Bennett by my side, feeling a mixture of anxiety and determination. Ryan and Margaret were already there, their faces cold and impassive. I couldn't tell if they were confident or just pretending, but it didn't matter. I was ready to face them. The trial was intense. Ms. Bennett presented the evidence meticulously, showing the court every detail of Ryan and Margaret's illegal activities. Bank statements, fake company records, shipping documents, it was all laid bare. Witnesses testified, including employees who had worked for their businesses and unknowingly been part of the schemes. I also took the stand, recounting my experience of being abandoned in the hospital and the emotional toll it had taken on me and my daughters. My voice trembled at times, but I didn't hold back. I wanted the court to see the truth, not just about their crimes, but about their cruelty. Ryan and Margaret's lawyers tried to discredit me, suggesting I was seeking revenge out of bitterness. But their arguments couldn't hold up against the mountain of evidence we had. By the end of the trial, it was clear that Ryan and Margaret had no defense. The judge's ruling came swiftly. Ryan and Margaret were found guilty on multiple charges, including financial crimes and abandonment. Their assets, including their home, were seized by the court. To my surprise, the court awarded the house to me as compensation for the suffering they had caused. It felt like poetic justice. The very home they had tried to build on lies was now a sanctuary for my daughters and me. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Justice had been served, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free. But I knew this wasn't just a victory for me. It was a message to everyone who had ever been wronged, showing them that it's possible to fight back and win. The moment I stepped out of that courtroom, a flood of emotions washed over me. Relief, pride, and a renewed sense of purpose coursed through me as I held my daughters tightly in my arms. Justice had been served, and the people who had betrayed me were finally held accountable for their actions. But this wasn't just about the courtroom victory. It was about reclaiming my life and building a future for my daughters. The news of the trial's outcome spread quickly, amplified by the media attention and my social media posts. People who had followed my journey cheered for my victory. Strangers messaged me, thanking me for standing up and sharing my story. Some told me they found the courage to leave toxic relationships because of what I had done. It was overwhelming to realize the ripple effect of my actions, and I felt deeply grateful for the support. As for Ryan and Margaret, their downfall was swift and merciless. The court's decision left them without the wealth and power they had so carefully built through their illegal activities. Ryan's business empire crumbled, and Margaret's reputation, once carefully maintained, was in shambles. They both faced jail time for their crimes, ensuring they couldn't hurt anyone else. The very people who once stood by their side now distanced themselves, disgusted by the truth that had come to light. The house that the court awarded me became a new chapter for my daughters and me. Walking into it for the first time as its rightful owner was a surreal experience. This was the same house where I had once dreamed of building a happy family with Ryan. Now, it was a symbol of my resilience, a place where I could raise my daughters in peace and safety. David stayed by my side throughout the entire transition. His unwavering support was the foundation of my strength, and I would never forget the role he played in helping me fight back. "You did it, Laura," he said one evening as we unpacked boxes in my new home. "You've shown them and the world just how strong you are." But even with justice served, I knew my journey wasn't over. Healing from the betrayal and rebuilding my life would take time. I started therapy to work through the emotional scars left by Ryan and Margaret. My therapist helped me process the pain, teaching me how to let go of the anger and focus on the love I had for my daughters. I also found support in a community of women who had faced similar challenges. Together, we shared our stories, encouraging one another to keep moving forward. It was through these connections that I realized the importance of using my experience to help others. That's when I decided to dedicate part of my time to advocacy. I began writing more about my journey, sharing the lessons I had learned, and offering advice to others who might be trapped in toxic relationships. My social media presence grew, and soon I was invited to speak at events and support groups. Each time I shared my story, I felt a little stronger, a little more free. My daughters, now thriving and full of life, became my greatest joy. Watching them grow reminded me of why I had fought so hard. I wanted them to know that their mother stood up for what was right, that I didn't back down even when the odds were against me. They deserved a life free from fear, and I was determined to give them that. One evening, as I sat in the living room of our new home, watching my daughters play, I reflected on how far I had come. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared entirely, but it no longer controlled me. Instead, it had become a part of my story, a reminder of my strength and resilience. Dr. Olivia, who had been there for me from the beginning, visited one day. She smiled as she looked around the house, her eyes lighting up at the sight of my daughters. "Laura," she said, "you've built something beautiful here. I always knew you had it in you." Her words stayed with me. I had been broken, betrayed, and abandoned, but I had risen from it all. My story wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life and turning my pain into power. And now, I was ready for whatever the future held, knowing that I had the strength to face it all. This is my story, a journey of betrayal, resilience, and justice. It wasn't easy, but I learned that even in the darkest moments, there is light if you fight for it. My daughters and I have found our light, and I hope my story inspires others to find theirs too.